I wanted to pull my hair out of my head.
You'll have to read it to me because I've been reading Proctor and Frere off the internet because it's still buried in a box somewhere.
All right, let me
All
read.
right, I got it. The second sentence is, simplicity was gained by the omission of numerous ancient features of the medieval offices. The doctrinal reform necessitated the removal, not simply of objectionable features in the old service, which were few, but still more of innocent things, which were misunderstood and perverted to support the false concepts which were current, such as the theory of transubstantiation and other still more gross popular misconception of Eucharist doctrine. That was the whole sentence.
Okay.
I'm not sure what
about Frere is that he was a liberal Catholic along the lines of Charles Gore.
Oh, okay. Well, that answers the question.
And I don't think Proctor was an awful lot different in outlook. I think he was Tractarian bordering on ritualist.
Yeah. The way he phrases it is so vague.
It's deliberately vague. It's one of those sling enough manure and some of it will stick comments.
Okay.
Well, and this brings back to the point I was talking about on some of the other stuff I've read, which I'm more into the English and Irish. He's even almost saying here he's not talking any German influence. I mean, it's very like it was all English, bro, and there's no anybody else involved.
Remember, this is. I mean, that thing was revised about the time of the Boer War, and. It suffers a lot from the Little Englander mentality of late Victorian Anglican apologetics, which explains a lot about the continuing Anglican movement, but that's a whole other discussion, and I'm not going to get into it today. The trouble with Frere is that in many ways the best part of that book really is the analysis, not the history. In that he is very good at tracking down where things come from. What he is less good at is engaging with the Reformation, because as a fully paid up member of the Community of the Resurrection, he was not, I mean, the Reformation went downhill for him in 1536 when they started closing monasteries, because he lived in one. So, it's Frere. The thing with Frere is easy to get a hold of, and I didn't much fancy using Parsons because Parsons can be as peculiar the other way. In his case, the liberal direction.
The only thing that popped into my head was the way he made this statement, but still more of innocent things which were misunderstood and perverted to support the false conceptions which were current, such as the theory of transubstantiation.
I think he's
the way that reads, I don't know whether I don't know whether the doctrine of transubstantiation was misunderstood or whether it was a false conception. I don't know what he's saying.
I think he's saying it's a false conception.
Oh, okay.
Because I know some of, but what were the still more gross popular misconceptions of the Eucharistic doctrine?
What could be grosser than transubstantiation?
Host story.
Well, I know, but if you say that and then you're adding something else, I mean, I understand transubstantiation as being one that was Raleigh, but what else? I don't really quite sure if I've read that there was anything else that was.
Well, he would be talking about each mass being a sacrifice with a definite and objective value. Another thing that's probably in there is all the legends about bleeding hosts and things like that. So, he's dealing with that whole late medieval kind of over-the-top Eucharistic devotion that, quite frankly, is half the reason we had a Reformation. Okay. My clock is making it 6:30, or rather 18:30, because it's on army time. So I suppose I'd better make a start. When Mary died on the 17th of November 1558, she was followed a mere 12 hours later by Reginald Cardinal Pole, the last Roman Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury. Mary was succeeded in accordance with Henry VIII's will by her half-sister Elizabeth. But what was much less obvious than the line of succession was the direction the new settlement in religion would take. One thing that was fairly clear is that the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn was probably not on the Pope's Christmas card list. And as a result of this, it was thought highly likely that at the very least Elizabeth would restore the situation to where it had been at the close of her father's reign, and perhaps even sanction further reforms. Elizabeth had been schooled by Christian humanists, often of a very Protestant bent, like Sir John Cheek. Cheek was a friend of both Matthew Parker and our old friend Martin Butzer. So you can see Elizabeth as fitting in very much with the humanist and reformist circles in England under Edward VI. Matthew Parker seems to have been a bit of a father figure in some respects for Elizabeth, in that he had been her mother's chaplain. And when Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, just before she died, she asked Matthew Parker to keep a particular eye on her daughter. And the two seem to have crossed each other's paths very regularly through the next 20 years. Parker was the former dean of Clare, a suppressed chantry college. He'd been Master of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and briefly Dean of Lincoln before the death of Edward VI. He was definitely on the reforming side, having married as soon as it was possible to do so in 1547. Parker weathered the storm of Mary's reign by remaining in England and keeping out of the way of the authorities as much as he could. There's a little bit of a joke that he spent 5 years studying Anglo-Saxon manuscripts and hunting, which kept him away from the attentions of the authorities. However, like Elizabeth, he had little understanding of the more extreme Protestantism that had been engaged with by the Marian exiles. And I think that almost made him a shoo-in for Elizabeth as Archbishop of Canterbury. But for the first few months, Elizabeth played her cards very close to her chest in terms of which way the actual settlement was going to go. It's fairly obvious from who she chose as her key advisors, men like Suffolk, Sir William Cecil, Walsingham, that she favoured, but not exclusively, the reformist side. Also, at her coronation, she tipped her hand a little bit by saying to the Abbot of Westminster, "Away with these tapers, I can see perfectly well," when she was greeted at the door of the abbey in the traditional manner. She also ordered the bishop who was celebrating Mass at her coronation to omit the elevations at the consecration. So there was sort of a clue there that the eventual settlement was going to be reformist in some way, shape, or form. Cecil certainly encouraged her to be cautious. England was at that point probably still 7/8 Catholic, once you got away from the major East Coast cities like London, Norwich, Hull, and Ipswich. And if the topic had been subject to popular vote at that time, most people probably would have welcomed a return to the situation as it had been under Henry VIII. A national church, but one that was still largely Catholic in its practice. What happened was a little bit different. Elizabeth, being a committed Protestant, was going to pick one of Edward's two books as the basic text of the Reformation settlement. The royal supremacy was restored quite quickly in the first parliamentary session of the new reign, but the prayer book took a little longer. There may, but this is not definite, may have been some discussion as whether or not the first book was to be preferred to the second. But in the end, it was the second book, that of 1552, that prevailed, although it was amended. A further problem for the new regime was the fact that the Marian bishops proved remarkably loyal to the Pope, and only Anthony Kitchen, the Bishop of Llandaff, remained in office under Elizabeth. The other 16 bishops resigned their sees rather than accept the new settlement. However, that wasn't a problem from the point of view of maintaining the succession, because enough of the bishops who had been deprived under Mary I of the Protestant variety still remained to secure the historic succession to the new bishops. Many of those who were appointed bishop by Elizabeth had been in exile during Mary's reign. For instance, Edmund Grindal, Robert Horne, Edwin Sandys had all been abroad during Mary's reign. However, she chose Matthew Parker as Archbishop of Canterbury, almost, one feels, as a counterbalance to the newer continental influences that people like Edwin Sandys brought into the English Church. The 1559 prayer book was not a straightforward reissue of 1552, but very few of the amendments were actually in the main text. It was the rubrics that got played with. And these small but significant changes would have restored a much more traditional appearance to the church's liturgy had it not been for the returning exiles. So you find in the 1559 text the original version of the ornaments rubric. The black rubric on kneeling that had been inserted at the last minute in 1552 is deleted in 1559. And you find in one of the few amendments to the actual text the combination of the 1549 and 1552 words of administration that we use to this day. Also, the petition against the Pope in the litany is retired in 1559, so we no longer refer to the Bishop of Rome as a detestable enormity. Well, not in the liturgy anyway. None of these changes were major in and of themselves, but taken together they produced a book that felt much more traditional than that of 1552. The main culprit for this more traditional feel was the ornaments rubric, which ordered that, firstly, morning and evening prayer were to be said in the accustomed place. Secondly, that chancels were to remain as in times past. And thirdly, the minister at the time of the Holy Communion and at all other times of his ministration shall use such ornaments as were in use, ... in the second year of the reign of King Edward VI. That probably was intended because of the way in which Acts of Parliament were logged in those days. That was probably a reference to the first prayer book and its rubrics, rather than, as Percy Dearmer rather fancifully thought in the Parson's Handbook, a reference to the last year of the Sarum Rite. The plan to restore a moderated form of the traditional ceremonial didn't work out very well. The theory was that the English service would have looked something like that in Lutheran northern Germany, where chasubles, albs, elaborate church music were part of the week-by-week liturgy of the church and were to remain so until rationalism and Napoleon intervened at the end of the 18th century. However, a lot of those who were appointed to livings during the first few years of Elizabeth's reign were Marian exiles who had spent their time during Mary's reign in the flesh pots of Geneva and Zurich, picking up far purer, as they saw it, notions of the Reformation than those of folks who remained at home like Matthew Parker. Indeed, Parker's own consecration as a bishop was something of a foretaste of the problems which would face the archbishop when it came to ceremonial during his tenure. Of the 4 bishops who consecrated him, only William Barlow, the former Bishop of Bath and Wells and at this point Bishop-elect of Chichester, was vested correctly in alb and cope. The 2 other bishops, Hodgkin and Scory, wore choir habit, and dear old Miles Coverdale was wandering around in a long black gown. The rite used was that of 1552, authorised by the Queen as Supreme Governor. There's a later story produced by the Jesuits that Matthew Parker was not properly consecrated. It's known as the Nag's Head Fable. And one of the things that's very noticeable about Matthew Parker's consecration is the level of detail with which it is recorded in the Archbishop's Register. Because I think they suspected the Romans would get cute about Matthew Parker's consecration at some point. It was soon clear that the ceremonial provisions of the 1559 prayer book were not going to be followed by many of the returning exiles, and in general, the refusal to conform was probably strongest in London. Now, London was particularly difficult to get a handle on because in those days, the city was divided up into rather an elaborate network of peculiars, which are special jurisdictions, belonging to bishops other than the Bishop of London. For instance, the Church of St Mary Le Bow is to this day technically part of the Diocese of Canterbury, not part of the Diocese of London. There was also a little enclave around Ely Place that belonged to the Bishop of Ely. So you have this patchwork quilt of jurisdictions in London that made it very difficult, even if he'd wanted to, for the Bishop of London to exercise any great discipline on the returning exiles who were increasingly appointed to city livings. Parker had 2 major headaches throughout his the first few years of his primacy. The first of which was to maintain something that approached order. There was a tendency on the part of the returning exiles to abridge the prayer book services at will, to omit the required vestments, and to generally practice nonconformity. On the other hand, if you were up in Lancashire and Yorkshire, you probably found that the local vicar only celebrated the Reformed service when somebody was looking, and was quite happily off in a corner celebrating Mass the old way when nobody was looking. The vicar of my home parish got prosecuted as late as 1584 for keeping a popish petty school. And Barton, being a fairly decent-sized market town, would have been pretty much under official supervision during Elizabeth's reign. On the other hand, in areas where the local magnates, the great landed gentry, were sympathetic to the Reformation, any attempts on the part of the clergy to maintain traditional usages would have been stillborn. And a series of instructions went out from Matthew Parker, setting as the legal minimum the following vestments: cassock, gown, square cap, surplice, tippet and hood in parish churches and in the street, and in addition the cope was required for the celebration of Holy Communion in cathedral and collegiate churches. Even this level of conformity was hard to maintain, especially in those areas with a large proportion of returned exiles such as London, Essex, Norfolk and Suffolk. A further problem was the habit of some of the exiles of abridging the prayer book service. The usual excuse for this was that they found parts of it offensive. One particular part of the liturgy they seem to have had a major grudge against was the litany. Or their other excuse for abridging the liturgy was to make more time for preaching. Well, if you're having a problem saying the liturgy because you're preaching for 2 hours, that seems to me as though the problem's the sermon, not the liturgy. The result of this particular variety of nonconformity was a series of orders from Matthew Parker and Edmund Grindal requiring that Matins, Litany and Communion be read without intermission or omission in parish churches. So you began to get the good old Sunday morning marathon of morning prayer, litany and anti-communion, rounded off with a sermon and prayer for the church, to be read every Sunday in parish churches. Although this order did not apply to cathedrals, which continue to break the morning service in two, with matins being sung quite early in the morning, around 6 a.m. or 7 a.m., and litany and communion following around 9 or 10 a.m. in the traditional slot reserved for High Mass. Another accommodation aimed at the Germanical spirits that had come back from Switzerland and Rhineland, Germany, was the revival of the Edwardine custom of placing the Holy Table in the middle of the chancel when Holy Communion was celebrated. Now, as you'll remember from last week, under the 1552 prayer book, the table was placed down the length of the chancel and the communicants knelt around it. And this was again the usual custom in parish churches under Elizabeth. But one thing the Elizabethan bishops are quite insistent on is when the table isn't being used, it's put back against the east wall, turned altar-wise, and treated with respect. In other words, please do not use it as a hat rack, somewhere for the carpenter to mend pews, or any other of the many, many nefarious purposes of which church wardens complained that communion tables were put to. By 1570, I think the best way of describing the Vestarian situation in the Church of England is a sort of stalemate. The bishops had imposed a lower Vestarian standard in exchange for a reasonable level of conformity from the clergy. But the exiles were still seeking further changes in the Elizabethan settlement. They hadn't got the hint after 12 years that things were not going to change in a hurry. So in 1570, an admonition to Parliament was put together by John Field and Thomas Wilcox, which demanded, amongst other things, further reform of the prayer book, the removal of the remaining popish elements from the liturgy and from the appearance of churches, and the abolition of episcopacy and its replacement with the Presbyterian system. Needless to say, that did not go over well with Elizabeth. But following the excommunication of Elizabeth by Pope Pius V in 1571 via the bull Regnans in Excelsis, a second admonition was put together by Thomas Cartwright, which pressed the claims of Presbyterianism once again. This proved to be a bit of a career ender for Thomas Cartwright because he was driven out of his fellowship by John Whitgift, the Master of Trinity and Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, and he found it expedient to retire to the Netherlands. Apparently, he found England a little bit dangerous to his health at this point. Calls for replacement of the prayer book with a Genevan-style liturgy continued at intervals through the reign of Elizabeth, but were met with blank refusal or a deafening silence from the Queen, who seems to have been pushed as far as she wanted to go by the events that followed the 1559 settlement. And the subsequent attempts to find a modus vivendi with the returned exiles, who were increasingly forming a party within the national church. One of the things we need to get out of our heads so far as the Elizabethan Church is concerned is the idea of the Puritans as somehow being a separate group. Many of them were amongst the most devout and spiritually uplifting members of the established church, but they were very definitely of the opinion that the Reformation hadn't gone far enough. And they had been impressed by what they had seen in Zurich, in Geneva and Strasbourg when they were in exile. On the other hand, Elizabeth was equally adamant that she was not going to allow Presbyterianism or further reform of the prayer book. So she gave her support first to Matthew Parker and then to John Whitgift to undermine organized Puritanism as much as possible. Whitgift certainly showed considerable skills as an investigator in tracking down the origin of the Martin Marr prelate tracts and making sure that that particular printing press was closed down. But in the main, Elizabeth's religious policy evolved into a sort of stalemate where limited nonconformity was tolerated in the interests of the broader peace of the church. Now, Parker's 16 years as Archbishop were, in the main, fairly successful at containing dissent within reasonable bounds. Edmund Grindal very quickly got the wrong side of Elizabeth and spent most of his 7 years as Archbishop under suspension. Then Elizabeth appointed John Whitgift with the particular task of suppressing Puritanism, which he did with glee. One thing you need to understand about Whitgift, though, is that he was a thoroughgoing Calvinist. And in 1595, he got himself into trouble with the Queen, which was a little bit unusual for dear old Whitgift, who was a particular favourite of hers, by publishing the Lambeth Articles, clarifying the statements of the 39 Articles on predestination, which would have introduced a much stronger line on predestination than that contained in the 39 Articles. But otherwise, Whitgift's working relationship with Elizabeth was exceedingly smooth. Whitgift lived long enough to be present at the first session of the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, which took place, of course, at the beginning of the reign of James I. And what you find with the Hampton Court Conference is a limited attempt on James's part to try and smooth over the growing disagreement between Episcopalians and Puritans. The beginning of James's reign had been met with the Millennial Petition, signed allegedly by 1,000 ministers, which was presented to James on his way south from Edinburgh. James did what James was very prone to doing, which is accepting something graciously, promising to take action, and then putting it in a pile of papers somewhere and quietly forgetting about it. But he did, on this particular occasion, eventually do something about it, and this was the Hampton Court Conference. The Puritan element hoped for great things from James I. After all, he had grown up under the much purer religion of Scotland and was therefore expected to be sympathetic to Presbyterianism. Unfortunately, he'd had a gutful of Presbyterianism and wanted nothing to do with it in England. And if anything, the traffic was very much the other way. James pushed for the reintroduction of episcopacy into the Scottish Church, and eventually, after much gentle pressure on his part, he forces the Scottish Kirk to adopt the 5 Articles of Perth, kneeling for communion, private baptism, communion of the sick, confirmation, and the observation of holy days, especially Christmas and Easter, in 1618, some years after episcopacy had been reintroduced. However, the Hampton Court Conference was not a complete waste. A new translation of the Bible was authorized, which would be published without any gloss or note. This translation was prepared over the ensuing 7 years and was published in 1611. And it's usually referred to in England as the authorized version because of the inscription on the title page, authorized to be read in churches. Of course, in the US, it's usually known as the King James Bible. And it eventually supplanted the earlier Bishop's Bible of 1568 and the Genevan Bible of the late 1550s. And eventually the King James version of the Epistles and Gospels was incorporated into the prayer book. You must remember, with the Elizabethan and Jacobean prayer books, the Epistles and Gospels are drawn from the Bishop's Bible, the Great Bible, of 1537. Although Whitgift had been present at the beginning of the Hampton Court Conference, he died on the 29th of February 1604 and was replaced by Bancroft, the Bishop of London. Bancroft was another strongly Calvinist bishop, but he was one who kept up the pressure on the Puritans to conform to the established church. And a key part of Bancroft's program was that he finally got the canons of the Church of England updated. And the 134 canons of 1604 were to be the framework of English church law from 1604 to 1965, with only a brief intermission between 1644 and 1660. The canons put into some sort of usable and easily studied form the many injunctions, admonitions, and advertisements, as they were called at the time, that had been issued mainly by Matthew Parker, but some of them by Whitgift, in an attempt to bring some order to the chaos in the Elizabethan church. The 1604 canons basically set in stone the interpretation of the Elizabethan settlement that had been reached in the late 1560s. And from there on, that's the established framework that everyone is working within. Bancroft's attempts to pressurize the Puritans were reasonably successful, and some of them definitely felt that they had no future in England. And a small group of them took ship from Killingholme Haven to go to the Netherlands in 1607, and having found themselves in the supposed Calvinist utopia of the Netherlands, had a thoroughly uncomfortable time of it and eventually came back to England. They found the Dutch way too tolerant, which apparently is still a problem in Europe to this day. After their unsuccessful experiment in the Netherlands, they again took ship in 1620 and headed off for Massachusetts, where we hear their descendants are still making trouble. One of the interesting things about the original group of the Pilgrim Fathers is quite a few of them came from Lincolnshire, particularly from the Isle of Axholme, which was an area that seemed to be something of a hotbed of religious dissent, being on the borders of 3 dioceses and thoroughly overlooked by all of them. The historical significance of the Pilgrim Fathers is usually overplayed in American history. From the British point of view, we were basically getting rid of some very irritating people. And the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a very convenient place to put them. The main historical significance, though, of the Pilgrim Fathers is the sort of definition that they give to the Puritan movement under James I. In their way, they point up how successful the police measures of James's bishops had been. They felt sufficiently pressurized in England that the Netherlands or even the American colonies seemed a more likely place for them to be able to practice their religion in peace. However, the Pilgrim Fathers were not the first Englishmen to reach America. A far different experiment was conducted in Virginia, and it was the 1604 revision of the prayer book, which was more of a tidying up exercise than the real revision, that was brought to Virginia by Parson Hunt and the colonists in 1607. And it's very interesting to note that amongst the church goods with which the Virginia colonists were furnished was a cope for the celebration of Holy Communion. It's sort of the antithesis of the great Puritan experiment in New England. The Virginia colony was founded on the expectation that each county would have a courthouse and a church. And if you look at the early history of Virginia, you find that's very much the case. But of course, being removed from the oversight of the bishops in London, the Virginia church developed its own peculiarities, which we'll deal with when we're talking about the American Prayer Book next week. The other thing that came out of the Hampton Court Conference was a rather unfortunate remark on the part of James I. With his usual Scots ability to see the broader picture, he was heard to remark, "Nae bishop, nae king." And this eventually proved to be the case. After the unsuccessful archiepiscopate of George Abbot and the, quite frankly at times, Gestapo tactics of William Laud, England's long-delayed civil war took place between 1642 and 1645, and the king was very much the loser. The initial cause of the English Civil War was the publication of the first Scottish prayer book in 1637, which led to a rebellion and the signing of the Solemn League and Covenant by the Scots. The Bishops' War triggered the calling of the Short Parliament. The Short Parliament was dissolved after just a few weeks and replaced by the Long Parliament. And when the king refused to address the grievances of the Long Parliament, sides were picked and the Great Rebellion began. So, what was worship like under Elizabeth and James? Elizabethan visitation articles catalogue exactly what furniture was officially removed from churches in the 1560s. So, for example, superstitious images went out the door straight away. Rood lofts were removed from the top of rood screens quite early on because they were a favourite place for burning candles, often before images of the saints, or even where images of the saints used to stand. The roods were replaced by the royal arms fairly early in Elizabeth's reign, and altars were taken down and replaced with tables in 1560, 1561. Depending on the level of local zeal, Eucharistic vestments were generally burnt or hidden, 1560 to 64. Certain areas such as southern Lincolnshire, these orders were carried out extremely efficiently because Cecily Willoughby, who was the Duchess of Sussex, was a very keen Protestant, and she made sure that the orders were followed to the letter in the area under her influence. On the other hand, in some places up the Yorkshire Dales, Eucharistic vestments continued in use until they finally fell apart, or the authorities caught up with the local clergy. The prayer book interior, as it's referred to by church architectural historians, began to develop during this period. A seat was often placed close to the pulpit for the reading of morning and evening prayer. The rood screen was no longer the division between the clergy's part of the church and the laity's part of the church, but rather a division of the church into two rooms: the nave for morning and evening prayer, the litany and anti-communion, and the chancel for the Lord's Supper. On the occasions when the Lord's Supper was celebrated, which was usually about once a month under Elizabeth, as far as we're able to discover, the communion table was moved away from the east wall of the church, placed in the centre of the chancel and covered with a large white tablecloth made of linen over the usual frontal. The communicants sat in the old choir stalls and knelt to receive communion. The elements were leavened bread and undiluted wine. The service was probably about as simple as you could get in this period. And certainly in the average parish church, the musical component of the service was distinctly lacking. Marbeck's setting of morning and evening prayer and the communion service seems to have fallen out of use quite quickly. And most of the music would have been metrical psalms, principally in the 1570s right through to around 1700 from Sternholt and Hopkins' Old Version. The Old Version was mainly made up of versifications of the psalms into common metre and long metre. So tunes such as the Old Hundredth, which is commonly sung to the doxology in the American church, were part of the usual musical diet of the English parish church in this period. The vast majority of those attending church in the Elizabethan period would have been illiterate. English literacy rates around 1560 are roughly 16%. This was to slowly rise, interrupted by the setback of the English Civil War, until 1714, when 25% literacy is achieved, and then by 1760, the beginning of George III's reign, half of the population is literate. The psalm singing of those days would have been done by lining out. The parish clerk would sing a line and then the congregation would repeat it. Although don't get the idea that this was in any way, shape or form a disciplined proceeding. Everybody pretty much took their time over it, and the best way of describing it is something like the Gaelic psalm singing of the wee Frees in Scotland to this day, or what goes on in some of the primitive Baptist churches back in the hollows of West Virginia and Tennessee. It's known to musicologists as heterophony, due to the fact it is extremely chaotic sounding at first, yet it seems to work. The service would have been read back and forth between the parson and the clerk, with the congregation joining in such responses they knew by heart. The personal prayer books were extremely rare during this period. If the parson was a conformist, the surplice would have been worn for the liturgy, and then already the practice of changing into the gown for the sermon had grown up, and sermons were long. An hour was the usual sermon length in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. One direct consequence of the Reformation that I've already hinted at is the rising level of literacy. And so you begin to notice in this period one of the possessions that is willed from one generation to the next on a regular basis is the much treasured family Bible. And the possession of family Bibles is a good guide to the rising level of literacy in England. As for the quality of the clergy, it rose steadily during the 16th century. University-educated clergy rose from about 15% in 1559 to about 70% in 1600. The number of preachers increased considerably. Not always, in Elizabeth I's opinion, a good idea. And even relatively small places had preaching university-educated ministers by 1603. By contrast to the austerity of the average parish church, court, cathedral and collegiate church worship was relatively elaborate. Elizabeth I's crucifix and candlesticks are quite notorious in church history, but all cathedrals in this period would have been expected to possess copes for the celebration of Holy Communion, and the custom of using a deacon and subdeacon liturgically at the celebration of Holy Communion was maintained by the Elizabethan injunctions, although the deacon and subdeacon are referred to as the epistler and the gospeler in Elizabethan documents. Also, the standard of music in cathedrals was quite high. Thomas Tallis and William Byrd wrote music for both the Anglican liturgy and for the Latin Mass. Most musicologists think that Tallis's 40-part motet Speminalium was in fact written for Elizabeth I's 40th birthday in 1573, or on another occasion in the early 1570s when the Venetian ambassador was showing off, and there was a 24-part motet by, I think it was Gesualdo, was used in the liturgy at the Venetian embassy, and the royal court composer was expected to go one better, which is the origin of Speminalium. Latin was still used in the Queen's Chapel and in the universities. The standard of liturgy would have been very high in most places, although there were those cathedrals which probably bore a stronger resemblance to a dilapidated barn as to a place of worship. The major bust-up of the 17th century is a consequence of really Charles I's inability to govern effectively. So with the rise of English Arminianism in the 1620s, which is a little bit surprising considering that England sent its delegation to the Synod of Dort, the tension between Puritan and the bishops increased. And this was particularly sad in the case of people like Joseph Hall, who was a thoroughgoing Calvinist, but also a supporter of quite a high standard of liturgy. You know, he was a strong conformist. Eventually, the religious objections of the Puritans, who were heavily represented in the English middle classes, became grievances that would have been discussed in Parliament had Charles I actually bothered to call one. And as a result of this, when the long-delayed opportunity for debate takes place in 1640, the whole thing is a mess. William Laud is arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and subsequently condemned to death under Act of Attainder and beheaded on the 10th of January 1644-45. The king himself perishes on the 30th of January 1648-49. And for the next 11 years, Oliver Cromwell tries to cobble together some form of stable government for England. However, Cromwell, in some respects, was his own worst enemy. He prevented a settlement of the religious question by preventing attempts to establish Presbyterianism as the new order of things in the Church of England. He later purged Parliament, and finally his government lapses into military dictatorship from 1652 onwards. With Cromwell's death in 1658, his son, Richard Cromwell, becomes Lord Protector in his place. The younger Cromwell basically just isn't interested in being a military dictator. And so as the government of the country becomes increasingly paralysed, General Monk approaches Charles II to return to England. And as a result of General Monk's initiative, Charles lands in England on May the 29th, 1660, having promised temporary freedom of worship and calling for a conference to resolve the religious issues that had led to been a contributory part of the late rebellion. The settlement of 1662, which results from the Savoy Conference, is in many respects a return to the situation as it had existed under James I. Early attempts on the part of Laudian bishops like John Cosin to introduce something that resembled the ill-fated 1637 Scottish Prayer Book meet with a very cold reception from both Lord Clarendon, who was Charles II's Lord Chancellor, and from Archbishop Juxon. So eventually things return pretty much to the way they were. The attempt to reconcile the moderate Presbyterians through the Savoy Conference, I'm afraid, didn't work out very well. One of the major problems on the Presbyterian side was they couldn't sort the wheat from the chaff. So a lot of the complaints that they brought to the bishops were of very minor nature. For instance, one particular complaint was a request that the rubrics be amended so the burial office could be read inside the church in bad weather. And the bishops by this point had had enough. And one of their number exclaims, "This is better mended with a hat than a rubric." As a result, the opportunity to reconcile the moderate Presbyterians to the Church of England is very largely missed. But that doesn't mean to say that they didn't have some influence on the final shape of the 1662 prayer book. For example, the instructions that are given in the prayer of consecration for the minister to take the bread into his hands, to break it, and to lay his hands upon it, were suggested by one of the Presbyterian delegates to the conference. There were minor amendments to the rubrics, along with some attempts to modernize the prayer book by using the 1611 prayer book, which was something on which both the bishops and the Presbyterians could agree. The 1611 Bible, for the epistles and gospels in the new prayer book. However, the prayer book of 1662 differs very little from that of 1559, but there was one significant reappearance, and that is the black rubric reappears. But instead of denying that there is any real and essential presence in the bread and the wine, it is revised to say that there is no corporeal presence in the bread and the wine. No doubt a concession to the richer Eucharistic doctrine of the Puritans. And I'm rather aware of the fact that at this point I've run out of time. The thing to remember about the 1662 prayer book is it marks the end of a single national church in England. From St. Bartholomew's Day 1662 onwards, there was always a permanent dissenting Protestant presence in England. Small though it was part of the religious landscape from now on. As a result of the departure of many of the more radical Puritans, the Church of England assumes a more Laudian, a more liturgical character. And you can see the years 1662 through to 1692 as sort of a high church flowering in the Church of England. Although how that affected the ordinary parish church, we just don't yet have a thorough understanding of how it affected the average parish church. The departure of the Puritans made the Church of England a much more conformist body than it had been in the past. And from 1662 to this day, the Book of Common Prayer of the Church of England has remained very largely the same. 1662 is still the standard liturgy in England. The difficulty is finding it. Of course, there have been amendments from time to time to take care of things like the ministry of lay readers. So there is now a provision for the collect for the 21st Sunday after Trinity to be substituted for the absolution at morning and evening prayer. The calendar has been modified. The table of lessons for morning and evening prayer has been modified. The one that's usually printed in the front of prayer books today dates from 1871, and you'll usually find printed alongside it the 1922 calendar of lessons. Of course, the state prayers change at the beginning of every new reign, and royal marriages can occasionally cause problems with the state prayers, and in more recent times, royal divorces as well. But the 1662 liturgy remains to this day the official liturgy of the Church of England, and it was to serve as the basis for all further revisions of the liturgy as the Church of England and the Church of Ireland gave birth to the Anglican Communion. And that's where we leave it for this week. Next week, we will look at the Scottish and the American prayer books. Okay, it's good old question time now. Get your thinking cap on, Patrick.
Oh, I got it, and it's coming. I just got to find my question that I got from our canonical exam that I didn't know. Here it is. So, the bishop that I had at the time that I took this under, and we won't mention names, and then you reviewed this, and I skipped this question completely, and I have looked for this question everywhere in every book. So, and this is on the UECNA canonical exam. What acclamations respected to the gospel did Bishop Cozen fail to get included in the 1662 prayer book?
The ones you use in the 1928.
Yeah, but he wasn't alive in 1928 if he got them in 1662.
Right. They continued in use, but they weren't printed in the prayer book.
Oh, okay.
Get them printed in the prayer book in 1662. But dear old Bishop Juxon kind of just put his foot down and said, 1559 prayer book with as few emendations, as few alterations as possible. So, although glory be to thee, O Lord, and thanks be to thee, O Lord, were used in the congregation and are in fact printed in the Free Church of England prayer book from 1877, they never made it into the 1662, even though they were used anyway.
And what book do we get this out of as a reference? Is that in a particular, what particular book is that in?
Well, I know about it from John Overton's biography of Bishop Cozen, which goes into some detail about Cozen's attempt to try and get something pretty close to the Scottish Prayer Book of 1637 introduced in England. And there survives to this day about a 1618 copy of the prayer book with all of John Cozen's alterations in it. It's known as the Durham Book. And it bears a remarkably close resemblance in terms of its Eucharistic rite to the American 1928 prayer book. The only thing that really differs is the placement of the invocation of the Holy Spirit, which, of course, in the American book is after the words of institution, but in the Durham book is before the words of institution, as it was in the 1637 Scottish book.
It only took me 10 years to find that answer. And I've hunted and hunted and hunted.
I've got questions from 30 years ago I'm still working on, so...
It's bugged. And I don't know why you guys put that in the canonical exam. I guess just to screw with us. Yeah. And I mean, it's like every night I stay awake still. It's like when you went to this, you said we were going to do the prayer book and you were going to talk about the 1662. I said, I know the question. I'm going to pull it up from the canonical exam from 10 years ago and I'm going to hit you with it. And you better be able to answer it.
Yeah, I do know the answer to that one. Yes.
Hey, I got another question for you, because in this I've studied more on, even on, but James, when he was in Scotland before he became, he tried to get a Bible done, and they would not go with that at all. And
Yeah,
then
they
he
were quite
tried,
happy with the Genevan translation.
yeah, and then they, the bishops and a lot of this, and it always seemed to me that when he came to England, and maybe you can, I haven't read enough totally on him, just enough to really get probably the 25-50% version, but I don't get the impression that he was very Presbyterian. And I think even when he came to England, I don't think the way he shifted the church and some of the things he did, and he stood up against the Puritans and some of the nonsense that was going on, I think he was a little more, I don't want to say Catholic, like Catholic of the day, maybe more of what we call Anglo-Catholic today than Catholic of that day.
James is a bit of an enigma in some respects, in that he rarely said everything that he was thinking. However, it's a lot easier to read than Elizabeth I. The main thing you have to remember about James I is doctrinally, he was a thorough-going Calvinist. The second point was he had had such a gutful of the General Assembly of the Kirk that he did not want to introduce Presbyterianism in England, and he wanted to clip its wings in Scotland. The Scottish Church did not become Presbyterian overnight. It takes 139 years for Presbyterianism to finally win. John Knox had to agree to the Tolkien bishops in order for church revenues to be preserved to the Kirk, rather than them finding their way mysteriously into the pockets of the lords of the congregation. There was a temporary abolition of Presbyterianism, of episcopacy from 1591 through to 1609, if my memory serves me correctly. Then James has bishops placed over the presbyteries, which in themselves occupied the same boundaries as the old Scottish dioceses. And as a result of this, you have a sort of bishop in presbytery situation in Scotland throughout James's reign into Charles's reign, with the bishops acting pretty much as permanent moderators for the presbyteries, that would replace the dioceses. James did not like Presbyterianism. A lot of it was its democratic character, and also the fact that I think he probably had been described once too often by Andrew Melville as God's silly vassal. Silly in those days meant weak. James just thought that Presbyterianism and monarchy were incompatible. And it was a point of view that was shared by Charles I with predictable results, which, that's part of the run-up to the Bishops' War and the English Civil War. James, on the other hand, was a thoroughgoing Calvinist. He was responsible for making sure and paying for an English delegation at the Synod of Dort. He wanted the canons of the Synod of Dort publicised and taught in the Church of England, and he gave that job to Bishop Davenant and to Bishop Hall, amongst others. So you can't really describe him as Catholic in any doctrinal sense, but certainly he had a lot more patience with the traditional government of the church by bishops than he ever had with the presbyteries.
Follow-up question on that. So he definitely wasn't Jacobite leaning. Because like where the McLaughlin Castle is in the western south part of Scotland is right at Loch Finn where the Queen landed, and we actually Jacobites attacked a English town just south, and then the whole English army came and blew our castle to smithereens. But you know, I was just wondering if that played in, because sometimes in his readings you kind of see like there was a conflict there. Was there any conflict, by the way, of any of that involved there, or was that, because I know that was a strong political pull, and then when he was younger, the way he was raised and without anything, I mean, I'm just curious, you know a lot more than I do, so I'm just asking a curiosity question.
James was raised as a Calvinist, not so definite about him being raised as a Presbyterian. Certainly his religious commitment to Calvinism is strong. Most of the surviving members of his family, which is like his uncles and his second cousins, the various Stuarts that were born the wrong side of the blanket, were Presbyterians or strong Protestants. Catholicism in late 16th century Scotland is pretty much confined to the Highlands and Islands. And the reason Catholicism survived there is the language barrier. There were not sufficient Gaelic-speaking ministers to make much of a dent on the Highland and Islands in terms of converting it from Catholicism to Presbyterianism. And indeed, really the Highlands were not converted to Presbyterianism until well after 1689. The Jacobite thing really is from a later period, with the abdication of James II in 1688. The Scots became divided between those who supported the old king and those who supported William II. And that was a division that pretty much ran through the Episcopal minority, with the Catholics, a majority of Episcopalians supporting James II, of course, who was James VII of Scotland, and a minority of Episcopalians and most Presbyterians supporting William and Mary. And this was something that bubbled along in Scots politics all through the 18th century, and is part of the reason why Scotland had two episcopal churches for most of the 18th century. On the one hand, there was the indigenous Episcopal Church using the Scottish liturgy, which was officially didn't exist. It was a persecuted and proscribed organisation. And then there were the qualified chapels, which technically were under English or Irish bishops, which used the English prayer book and were licensed by the government in London as a sort of official Anglican or Episcopalian presence in Scotland. And that's one of the reasons why, to this day, the Scottish prayer book has both the English form of the communion service and the Scottish liturgy in it. Because they had, in 1790, after 1793, when there's a determined attempt on the part of the Scottish bishops to bring the qualified congregations that use the English prayer book into the Scottish Episcopal Church, they have to allow the English communion service. Now, in many other respects, the Scottish Episcopal Church would look quite Presbyterian to us, in that they did things like issue communion tokens like the friendly Presbyterians up the street. They wore black gowns. The surplice was not seen in Scotland until the 1820s. And then it was the victim of such subtle remarks as, "There he gang, the whited sepulchre." Certainly the Presbyterian laity took a very dim view of Episcopalian clergy wearing surplices. So it's really more of an 18th century thing than a 16th century thing.
and maybe you're going to talk about this a little tomorrow. And I've done it because being a Virginian, Virginia is my big study, Jamestown, all that. But there's quite of a little, I don't want to say gap. I haven't really, and maybe being on the other side of the pond, there's a little more reading, or some more books. But when the from my understanding, that really the Americas did not get touched that greatly by what was going on in England during the Revolution, or Commonwealth taking over, the loss of the king, and the Anglicans pretty much they
were pretty much left alone in Virginia.
But I'm not quite sure. There's like a gap where you kind of read between the lines sometimes, like maybe nobody wants to comment specifically. I get the feel that it never really stopped.
Right. There's an expression in the Isle of Man. If somebody's being obnoxious, they look at you and say, "There's a boat in the morning," with the implication that you ought to be on it. And that was sort of the response that orders from Parliament in London to stop using the prayer book got in Virginia. So I think what happens during the Commonwealth in Virginia, and this is going to get confusing because Virginia is a Commonwealth, during the English Commonwealth, Virginia probably preserved quite a bit of the prayer book. Certainly there's no big turnover of ministers in Virginia in the 1640s and the 1650s as there was in England. So I guess what you can say about the religious situation in Virginia is there's an awful lot of Anglican survivalism under the Commonwealth, the English Commonwealth. And of course, when Charles II is restored in 1660, Virginia very rapidly gets back to business as usual. But of course, the Virginia church didn't have the problems with private patronage, the bishops appointing unsuitable ministers that were the case in England, because the vestries were already taking a very large part in appointing ministers. And quite frankly, if they didn't particularly like a minister, they found a way of shipping him on somewhere else. So Virginia's history when it comes to the appointment of the clergy has always been sort of quasi-oligarchic, in that the vestries pretty much controlled who their ministers were from quite early on in the Church of Virginia's history.
Sorry.
And during the English Commonwealth, that would have played in favour of a continuation of prayer book-like services. They maybe left odd bits out so they couldn't be charged with using the prayer book. But on the other hand, I think probably a lot more of the feel of Anglican worship was maintained in Virginia than was very commonly the case in England.
Well, I know up north, and because of the Puritan influences that we get in the northern seaboard states, and then like Quakerism and the Quakers, more in that middle of the Pennsylvania region. But you get in Virginia, we've always been Anglican, and I really have a firm grasp and talk quite intensely on the evangelical Wesley influence on the Virginia church. Mm-hmm. But when we landed in Jamestown, and I know it was a lot plainer, it was very simple. But were the guys on this time very Calvin landing?
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
Calvinism was the orthodoxy of the Church of England in the 1600s.
Yeah, I know there was no candles, there was no nothing.
Right.
Basically, no, sir. In my understanding, it was probably more heavily in that factor of almost following in the Puritan and.
Yeah, but a lot of it was just simply the problem of being on the frontier.
Okay.
Virginia churches in between 1607 and about 1667, the vast majority of them are large log cabins. The first brick churches are somewhere around 1640. We don't know whether they used the surplus consistently after the first few years. I suspect probably not. Certainly in terms of discipline, Virginia clergy had an uphill struggle against the planters, as the planter class grew, because quite frankly, the planters paid the parson, and just as the saying, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. The parsons were very much dominated by the vestries, and it was not always a healthy thing. So you have a sort of quasi-congregationalism grow up in Virginia, which on the one hand is very much rooted in the established church, but on the other hand, they're quite capable of taking care of business for themselves, and often do. Now, the interesting thing about Virginia and evangelicalism, of course, you've got Devereux Jarrett, who really is one of the few identifiable Episcopalian evangelicals before the Revolution. Because although Wesley was very influential in America, although Whitefield was very influential in America, most of their influence went either in the direction of the Methodist societies in the case of the Wesleys, or in the case of Whitefield, a lot of his influence led to a revitalization of New England Congregationalism. Although in England, Whitefield was the inspiration behind the Countess of Huntingdon's Connection. The Countess of Huntingdon's Connection gave birth to the Free Church of England, and the Free Church of England eventually made common cause with the Reformed Episcopal Church in the USA. Because Calvinistic Methodism in America didn't really develop as a separate church the way it did in England, and particularly Wales. As on the whole, evangelicalism in the Episcopal Church doesn't get going until roughly 1810. The traditional date for evangelicalism kicking off in the Episcopal Church, of course, is the consecration of Alexander Wietz Griswold as Bishop of the Eastern Diocese in 1811. That was the same year that William Meade was ordained deacon at Williamsburg. There's a few slightly earlier figures like Isaac Milner in Philadelphia and later New York. But, evangelicalism really does not get going until about 1810.
So in the 1600s, was there a head of the church in Virginia, or?
Not until 1694, when the first of the commissaries were sent out by the Bishop of London. I think the first one was James Blair, who was responsible, amongst other things, for founding William and Mary. He was also one of the advocates for the creation of the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which began to plant Anglicanism in New England. Also, another early SPG project was planting early Anglican chaplaincies in India. But the strange thing in the Indian situation was, because they couldn't find clergy in England to go to India, they employed Danish Lutheran clergy to go to India to be Anglican missionaries. So prior to 1690, 1691, there really was no local government for the church in Virginia other than the governor and the vestries. And then they got the commissaries, and the commissaries were not consistently appointed. Bishop Gibson, of London, refused to appoint a commissary because he was trying to force the government to appoint a Bishop of Virginia. Of course, the Whigs wouldn't hear of it because, they feared they might have to have another bishop in the House of Lords. It hadn't quite worked out that Williamsburg is a heck of a long way from London.
And you do have to add that, these men weren't bishops, and their authority was pretty limited. Yeah, and if you were right around, the Williamsburg area, yeah, but now where most of these churches by the 1800s were planted all over Virginia, it was still free will roaming of the vestries. Mm-hmm. And, and each church was his little kingdom, fiefdom.
Yeah, I mean, Augusta Parish starts in 1754. It's one of the ones, relatively late before the Revolutionary War. And it's quite evident from the early records of the parish. They found a minister, they paid a minister. He was very much there at the behest of the vestry. And whatever arrangements the Bishop of London may have made for the oversight of the church in Virginia, they were basically overlooked by the vestries, who just went on doing what they'd always done.
Now, the English had settled a lot in Canada by this time as well.
Mm-hmm.
What form did the church take there?
There, the influence is very much SPG, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And they were a little bit more organized in the sense that the SPG board in London exercised some fairly effective oversight of the church in Canada. So, prayer books were provided by the society in England. They vetted the ministers that were sent out to Canada and New England. They actively pursued the education of suitable young men from Canada and New England for the ministry. So there's actually a much more proactive approach from SPG. The limitation, of course, is there's no bishop. And there isn't a bishop until 1787. But certainly the church in New England and the church in Canada, which was under the oversight of SPG, seems to have had rather better care from the church in England than Virginia and Maryland did because of the oversight from SPG.
Okay.
Yeah, no, hey, before we leave, I will add, if everybody's thinking about, because we had the Hudson Bay Company, you had, in Virginia especially, the guys that were coming to be priests here were the guys that couldn't really get a job in England. And if you were a priest, if you wanted to be a priest here, you had to go to England to get consecrated. And only if it was like the church in Williamsburg, if you were up like basically where Washington lived, you were Alexandria, you were in one of the big cities, then it would attract a phenomenally well minister because they could pay from England and they wouldn't settle for anything but one of the better guys from England. But, most of our little rural parishes weren't really indicted with the top class.
Yeah, I mean, America gets the same sort of clergy as the Welsh dioceses, the Isle of Man. There's a high proportion of Trinity College Dublin graduates because that was a cheaper education than Oxford and Cambridge. There's a fairly high proportion of guys who just straightforwardly read for orders, after grammar school. On the other hand, there's also a section of the clergy who are Oxford and Cambridge graduates who come out to the colonies because they are sick of being assistant curates in England. And they figure that the chances, that they fancy their chances on the frontier rather than perpetual penury as assistant clergy in the Church of England. Another source for Virginia clergy was Scotland, because after the disestablishment of the Episcopal Church in 1689, there were Scottish clergy looking around for jobs, and one of the places where they could get in was Virginia and Maryland. So you get a fair number of Scottish ordained clergy popping up in the American colonies in the 1680s, 1690s, 1700s, 1710. You also get Irish clergy out in America, just simply because they fancied their chances out on the frontier. They were dead-ended in Ireland or England and couldn't advance themselves. And you get a small number of homegrown clergy who went to William and Mary, or to the college in Philadelphia, or to King's College, New York, and then were sponsored either by the vestry of their home parish in the case of Virginia, or by SPG. I mean, for instance, Samuel Seabury was sponsored by SPG. He was a Yale graduate, as I remember correctly. And they were sent to England. They were ordained, usually quite quickly. They turned up, as soon as they got their land legs, they presented themselves to a bishop with their letters testimonial from the governor and from SPG. They were examined by the bishop's examining chaplain. They were ordained deacon. A week later, they were back an ordained priest. And then they were back on the boat. And hopefully, if they didn't end up whale food, they'd end up back in America, usually 6 months to a year after they'd left, and spent the rest of their career in America. But, at best, before the Revolution, 40% of the colonial clergy were homegrown.
And so would many of the clergy in Canada come through the Hudson Bay Company?
Yes. The Hudson Bay Company, like the East India Company, actively recruited clergy to go out as chaplains to the company. And they were very, very much on the ball with that. The Hudson's Bay Company certainly seems to have been very active in its attempts to secure chaplains for its factories in Canada.
Well, and the Hudson's Bay Company pretty much settled the province of Ontario.
Yeah. And Ontario becomes a bishopric quite early on. I mean, it's like third or fourth Canadian bishopric. Because after Nova Scotia, I think Upper Canada is either New Brunswick is next or Upper Canada. I'll dig the book out in a minute.
And you got to remember about the Hudson Bay Company, they controlled everything.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, the part of their process, they were very generous, but whatever priest they hired, they knew that priest, you basically worked for the company, or you were going to toe the company line, and everything that was all throughout the Canadian, it was very heavily, it's kind of like the old coal mines of West Virginia where you had the company store, you got your little company token, you had to buy everything from the company store. So they controlled well. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the towns, especially in northern Ontario, I mean, that was what they were they were company towns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Virginia didn't develop that way, only by an accident of history, which was, You know, the Virginia company proved to be so incompetent that they got their charter cancelled, and it became a royal colony, which opened it up considerably. But it's almost the case with Virginia that if you got in under the old company, you were in the, you know, you were in the driving seat when it came to the great land grab of the 1650s. So the great estates, like those of the Birds, the Lees, they developed out of the families that got here early on and were well positioned to take advantage as more land became available under royal patronage in the 1640s. The small farmers in Virginia were mainly, you know, it's a later date thing. It's the 1720s, the 1730s, the 1740s, as the Shenandoah Valley opens up. And this creates a whole new chapter in the history of Virginia, because the valley is not settled by Englishmen. The valley is settled by Germans and Scots-Irish. So when you go around this part of the world, you see an awful lot of German names like Koiner and Henkel. And you have early Lutheran churches. I mean, the place across the road is 1772. You find the Tunkers out here, you find the Mennonites, and the assembly back in Williamsburg is turning a blind eye to all of this because, you know, it's the other side of the mountain. It's a bit like if, you know, today, even today, when you go to Charlottesville and you talk to them about going over the mountain to Waynesboro, you know, they react as though they may be eaten by cannibals. You know, there's that much of a division between, you know, the Piedmont and the coast and the Shenandoah Valley. And, you know, down here, there's relatively, in the late 18th, early 19th century, there are relatively few Anglican churches. You know, the Episcopal Church is small and weak. The dominant denominations are Lutheran, Methodist, Tunker, Mennonite, Presbyterians coming up on the outside rails, and then you get pockets of German Reformed.
Well, you do.
That's who comes down the wagon road.
Well, and you do, but the Presbyterians have a lot larger role, especially around the 1800s, in the pockets that they settled, like where our family settled over in Highland County. There's dotteds. Like one of the first Presbyterian churches is right across where Fort Washington was, which fought the Indians. And but it's only, you're right. I mean, you get your Lutherans in an area, you get your Presbyterians in the area, but you do not have English over in the valley on the frontier.
Yeah, I mean, you get this situation where Waynesboro is heavily German. So our earliest church is a Lutheran, Tunker, Mennonite. The Presbyterians come quite a bit later. Stanton, I think the Presbyterian church is the second oldest.
Yes, it is. And that's why I'm saying you get the pockets of these different towns that settled that were, the Presbyterians moved in. The Scott-Irish, like Harrisonburg, my grandfather, great-great-grandfather, was one of the original founders of Harrisonburg, and they were Scott-Irish. And like the Presbyterian Church, I think, is the oldest church in Harrisonburg.
Yeah, it is.
But it just depends on where you were in the valley. It was so funny. You had these very clumps of groups that settled in specific places, and it's very funny even in the mountains.
The original settlers here were all from Saxe-Württemberg. You know, they were good Lutherans from, you know, Johann Brentz's backyard. And they settled in, you know, around Dooms and Cremora and down towards Waynesboro.
Yeah. And they all took different tracks. So the Scott Irish came from Pennsylvania down. And not everybody thinks everybody landed on the boat and came right to Virginia and crossed the mountain. That's not, they all had different tracks from the way where they landed. And Baltimore was the bigger port than Virginia, Norfolk was.
Yeah,
because it's a lot closer to the inland.
A lot of the Germans came in through Baltimore.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. I know we got way off track and everybody's really fascinated about our talk of the valley.
Summary question, Your Grace.
Yes?
With the completion of the 1662, how would you describe, from both an official Church of England standpoint and a practical outworking of liturgy, how would you describe churchmanship after 1662?
To us, it would seem quite low. So, the liturgy was read in surplice, tippet, and hood. The minister would change into a black gown to go into the pulpit. On the other hand, communion tables tended to stay against the east wall. There's an increasing prevalence of things like candlesticks on the altar. Now, the candles were rarely lit except, when it was dark. But you begin to get a little bit more decoration to churches as you go from the 17th century into the 18th. If you want a sort of normative 18th century approach to Anglican liturgy, look at something like Christ Church Spitalfields in London, one of Hawksmoor's great churches. They have these, very obvious preaching box naves with a 3-decker pulpit placed where, everybody can hear. And then they have a small room at the east end, still separated by some sort of a rood screen or chancel screen for the celebration of Holy Communion. That is the way the liturgy works. And it always seems to me that Anglican liturgy, in an international sense, ends up being somewhere between the Reformed tradition and the Lutheran tradition, in that you've got a very obvious inheritance from the Strasbourg liturgy, which is Reformed. You have an equally obvious inheritance from Brandenburg, Nuremberg, and from the pious consideration, or consultation, all of which sort of melds into the prayer book. The thing that is perhaps least Lutheran about the English situation is the infrequency of communion. At best, once a month. Small parishes were frequently down to 4 or 5 times a year. The old joke about the Church of England having 3 services, morning prayer, evening prayer, and stay behind, applies as much to applies particularly to the 18th century church. That said, the number of communicants to the population of England remains fairly high throughout the 18th century. It's somewhere around the 25% mark. So, there's a fairly high degree of participation in the sacrament on the rare occasions it occurs. And of course, some big parishes like Hull, where the population's about 10,000, and there are a lot of communicants, they celebrated communion every Sunday. And, the north end of the parish received one Sunday, the east end of the parish the next Sunday, the south side of the parish the next Sunday, the west side of the parish the following Sunday. So they didn't end up with, 700 communicants trying to scramble up to the rail on a Sunday morning, making the service 5 hours long.
Would you categorize that as what you've just described? Would you categorize that as a parliamentary mandate or the outworking of a practical application?
A little bit of both. You know, the 18th century is, yes, there's the parliamentary mandate, but under the Whigs in the 18th century, those things were on the statute book. They weren't enforced with any real degree of rigor. Okay. And then, of course, by 1750, 1760, you're beginning to get a very real revival in religion, because it isn't just the Wesleys and Whitefield. You've got Toplady, Romaine, Venn, Harvey, Fletcher. You know, you've got the 200 or 300 early evangelicals who are really reintroducing the English to the concept of vital religion. And at the same time, you've got high churchmen such as George Horne, who are very devout, who inspire by example. And they have tremendous influence within their own circles. So really, under George III, there is something of a general religious revival that feeds through into the 19th century, and the better-known revivals then in the form of, you know, the exponential growth of Methodism, the Oxford movement, even the revitalization of Roman Catholicism in England, comes out of the religious environment of the late 18th century. Okay, have I yacked your ears off enough?
I could stay here all night.
Yeah, I know us two are bad like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you really want, I got about 10, 15 more questions I can roll through, but being 8 o'clock, I figured I'd give everybody a break.
Okay. All right, then. Well, we'll call it a night, and I'll see you all next week, and we'll have a look at the Scottish and American prayer books. And then, so read the relevant chapter in Proctor and Frere. And then after that, I think we go on to the analysis of the various parts of the prayer book. Okay?
Okay.
Good night.
Have a great